welcome everybody to this Acoustics Research Centre seminar. We're very lucky to be joined by 4 external speakers today from the University of Manchester, who are going to speak about a new project that they've recently started on the topic of speech perception by autistic adults in complex environments. So over to you guys.
All right, thank you very much for letting us speak about the SPAACE Project, which aims to investigate speech perception by autistic adults in complex environments. What we mean by complex environments is complex listening environments, so places where you're trying to listen to a voice but there's other sounds going on at the same time. The project is a collaboration between George Bendo, Graham Hanks, Alex Sturrock, myself, Emma Gowan and Chris Plack, and assuming that we get our technical difficulties under control, the first 4 of those names will be speaking to you today. So because there are 4 of us talking, we need to be a little bit careful to try and run to time, especially because we've kicked off late, for which apologies. So we've got a couple of measures in place to try and ensure that. Oh, hello, Graham, you've popped up. And one of them is that we will ask everyone, if possible, to leave their questions till the end. And the other one is that if any one of us is waffling on incessantly, most likely me, we've agreed that they will be politely but gently interrupted. Okay, so I need to share my screen again. Right, lovely. So has that appeared for everyone? Lovely. Okay. Let me move on then. So the project kicked off thanks to the Autism at Manchester Research Network, which aims to bring together clinicians, researchers and autistic individuals and their families to share, understand and shape autism research. In terms of shaping research, they have an expert by experience advisory group that meets from time to time, and one meeting of that group back in July 2019 invited members to share their views on autism research priorities. And at that meeting, George Bendo and Graham Hanks had both independently identified speech perception in the presence of competing sounds as a potentially beneficial target for future research. Our first task one, I should say then, at that point, Alex was the one who then got George and Graham together with the rest of us, and the project team was formed. The first thing we needed to do was dive into the existing evidence, and what that revealed is that certainly there is very compelling, long-standing anecdotal evidence of speech perception differences amongst the autistic population, but the empirical evidence is somewhat opaque. So reports have tended to be pretty inconsistent, and the evidence that there is tends to be rather weak. And when we've looked at the constituent studies, that perhaps isn't terribly surprising. They are generally, although not absolutely always, underpowered. We're typically talking under 20 autistic participants in each. There's rarely any correction for multiple comparisons, so even the effects that are reported, when you look at them in a bit more detail, are not terribly convincing. The hypotheses tend not to be sufficiently shaped by autistic experience. So what we mean by this is that when you look at the papers that report these studies, they tend to have an introduction that has some general reference to difficulties with speech perception, or even just difficulties with auditory perception in the autistic population, and then it jumps very abruptly from that to a super specific auditory test without there really being much evident rhyme or reason in terms of how they've got there. Related to this is the issue that listening conditions used in these studies tend to be isolated rather than integrated. So, you know, you'll have one study over here that looks at open set word perception by kids in background babble, and over here you'll have a closed set sentence perception by adults in the presence of 2 competing talkers. And then when you're trying to understand the relation between disparate results of these studies, it's pretty difficult to figure out what's going on because you're just comparing apples with oranges all the time. Finally, there's the issue that pretty much always the data collection methods are not designed and refined to suit the needs of autistic participants. So it's often very unclear whether the limiting factor on performance is indeed speech perception or other extraneous factors. So the aims of our project then are to shed light on autism-related differences in speech perception by adopting a highly collaborative approach, by paying very detailed attention to autistic experience, by developing listening tasks and research hypotheses based on autistic insight, by inviting autistic people to inform and critique on every aspect of our research methods, and by conducting adequately powered research. In order to do this, we formed a collaboration between two auditory researchers, myself and Chris, two autism researchers, Alex and Emma, and two autistic researchers, George and Graham. Overview of the project then. The self-report phase, which was conducted in 2020, was aimed at hypothesis generation in a more systematic manner than the existing work in this field. And that consisted of two research studies. So one was involved a semi-structured interview with a very small participant sample, and one was an online questionnaire with a much larger participant sample. And then we are hoping to progress to a laboratory phase to test these hypotheses, and we're seeking funding to do this. Semi-structured interview is what we'll discuss first then. This involved 9 participants, none of whom had been diagnosed with hearing loss. All underwent an interview addressing 3 broad areas. The first was hearing abilities and difficulties. The second one was response to any hearing difficulties, and the third was their views on our hearing research. And the resulting data were thematically analysed by myself, Alex and Graham. The themes were then reviewed by George and Chris, and what this revealed was 6 main themes, 28 sub-themes and 73 tertiary themes. Okay, this is an overview of the themes and sub-themes. We are not going to outline the tertiary themes because the numbers were just getting kind of silly. And I'm also not going to read these out aloud. What I'll do is leave them on the screen while I hand over to, if he's popped up yet, Graham. Yes, there you are. Of course, you popped up a bit earlier. So we'll hand over to Graham. So I'll leave them up for you to have a read while I mute my mic. And then Graham will take you through some of the tertiary themes and associated quotes from some of our autistic participants. So if that's all right, I will mute myself now, and if you can get yourself set up, Graham, if that's all right.
Yep, no problem.
Wonderful.
Sorry to delay in joining. I didn't realise it was Teams, so I had to install the app before I could log in. Never mind. Yeah, one of the problems with autism is that actually that a lot of people don't even realise they have a problem. You've got this lived experience that all you've ever known is that problem. So therefore it seems normal to you to be that way. But it's not until you compare with other people you realise, hold on, this is a problem. It's not other people. It's not me that's struggling. It's other people who've got an easier time than I have. So it's just what you've always got to bear in mind when you're doing these research, is that very often there isn't always that much self-awareness of the problem for the individual themselves. Yeah, the thing one is auditory anomalies. What we found is that, which is quite interesting, is that background noises don't have to be loud to be a problem. It could be just 2 people chatting away in the background, and the average autistic person will still struggle. A lot of this is possibly down to top-down processing issues, where most people can filter out background voices, but autistic people can't. So we just hear everything all at the same time, all at the same volume. There is an issue, of course, of voices being drowned out by background sounds, especially low-pitched sounds. But that seems to be more down to auditory sensitivity rather than the ability to decode speech. It's usually competing speech that interferes with the ability to decode speech rather than the volume, but the volume is a contributing factor. The other problem is difficulty in orienting to a target voice. This is partially, if you imagine everybody's talking, they're all the voice at the same volume. It's very hard to distinguish which one is the person that's talking if there's other people talking at the same time. So then so in the normal hearing responses, you'd look to the person orient on that person's face, and then you can filter out all the background noises. And just concentrate on what that person's saying to you. But because autistic people can't filter out all these different background sounds, we don't know where to look or where this voice is coming from. We're aware there's a voice that's possibly talking to us, but could it be this person or that person? And if you can't orient on a voice, it's very difficult to decode that voice. Yeah, auditory overload. Again, this comes back more to sensory sensitivities. We're much more overwhelmed by loud noises than ordinary people are, and we can hear things that most people don't even realise that are there. It's interesting, actually, this quote here: "I'm not afraid of the crowd, I'm afraid of the noises of the crowd." Because I've just recently done research on on autistic experience of crowds, and the number one problem that was quoted from 100 participants was the noise of the crowd. And out of 100 participants, not one person said that noise wasn't an issue for them. That gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. And out of 100 people, not one said they didn't have an issue with the noise when they're in a crowded space. Yeah, distraction by other sensory modalities. Basically, because we have a lot of difficulty in filtering sensory inputs, you have the problem where you've got people talking, but you've also got all these smells coming in, you've got all the movement going on around you, and it's just too much for the autistic brain to cope with all of that information all at once because there is no filtering. So other sensory modalities such as smell, movements, all those things can actually distract your attention away from being able to understand what's going on. I mean, I personally have, on several occasions, had to literally leave a room or get off a train because somebody's coming with a strong perfume and it's so overwhelming. I just have to get out of there because it just overpowers. And so there's a lot of people that we talked to were saying that they found that distracted them from being able to concentrate on conversations. Social cognitive inference. Yeah, there's one of the tricks a lot of people use if they don't quite understand what's been said is they will backfill the information. You know, that you sort of take that bit of information, you think, and you sort of guess what that middle bit is that you've missed. But that's very difficult for people with autism. We're not as good at backfilling information as other people are because of our social communication problems. We can't hear a bit of conversation there, but successfully predict what that middle bit was or what the end bit was. We're no good at interpreting visual cues, so we can't guess from the person's expression on their face or how their body is angled on. These are all part of understanding conversation. It's not just what you hear in your ears, it's what you see with your eyes. It's the observation of the person's posture, their lips, everything. All those sensory inputs combine in order to enable a normal person to understand what's being said to them. If you take away a large chunk of that because we don't have those social cue abilities, those social visual abilities, that makes it even harder for us to understand what you're actually saying to us. So we are at a big disadvantage there. Compounding factors. Yeah, you do have a lot of problems in that people don't understand. And again, this comes back to what I was saying before about lived experience. if your lived experiences of being able to understand everybody in a crowd, that's all you've ever known. When someone says to you, I can't understand what people are saying, I can't cope with all this noise, for you it's like, I don't get it. What do you mean? I don't understand. So it's a two-way problem. In a way, you come into the double empathy theory of David Milton, you know, that one side doesn't understand the other side because they have two totally different experiences of the world. And a good illustration of this is one time me and my wife watched a video about just showing what it's like for somebody with autism to walk down the road, or what it's like for a non-person to walk down the road. And I turned to my wife and said, wow, is your world really that quiet? She was like, yeah. I said, is your world really that noisy? And I was like, well, yeah, it is. And it was that light bulb moment when we both realised that our two experiences of the world were so totally different. And this is why she'd never been able to understand my problems, and I'd never been able to understand why she couldn't understand mine. And this is the problem, you know, it's the lack of understanding of listening difficulties from other people. It's not ignorance, it's not willfulness, it's purely because they don't have that experiential viewpoint of actually knowing what it really is like to be autistic. Impact, so I move on quickly here. It causes huge barriers to be able to live your life the way you want to. You do start to avoid going to places because you know it's going to be noisy. People are missing out on life-enriching experiences. They're missing out on being able to go to cultural events because they know it's going to be too noisy. They miss out on family gatherings because they know it's going to be too noisy. And all of this can actually lead to people actually isolating themselves from the world outside because they can't cope with all that noise, all that sensory inputs. And there is a huge problem of loneliness and lack of joy in people's lives because they can't participate in the world around them due to these auditory sensory problems. Listening effort is basically what it says on the tin. It's hard work trying to decipher. When you have to decipher so many sensory inputs all at once, just a simple act of having a conversation can be very, very exhausting. I love conversations. I love communicating to people. I love having social interaction with other people. But within half an hour, I'm so exhausted. I just want to go and lie down somewhere because the effort over what is more overwhelming than the need to converse. And it's sad that a lot of people do have to see it as hard work. Obviously, the emotional impact is huge. I mean, as it says here, it's very stressful because you're missing out on stuff. You are acutely aware of the fact that you're not responding properly. You're misunderstanding what people are saying. So then you either don't say anything or what you do say is wrong. And then there's a huge sense of embarrassment and guilt because you've upset somebody by giving the wrong answer, purely because you didn't understand what the question was in the first place. And it's a huge juggling act, and there's a huge stress that somebody says something, you haven't understood what they said, and you know for a fact if you say, sorry, can you say that again? They're going to get annoyed with you because people don't like repeating themselves. But if you don't say, can you say that again? You've then got the problem of, I've got to try and figure out what this person has said to me. So you're working overtime, trying to put together all the clues, trying to figure out what that person said. Then you try to answer them, hoping to God that it's the right answer, which often it isn't. And it can be emotionally very, very challenging. And it's the problem which isn't just for in autism. I mean, I'm partially deaf myself, and I know for people who are hard of hearing have the same problems of struggling to communicate because they can't quite catch what the other person's saying. So it affects the deaf community almost as much as it affects the autistic community, but we've just got those extra difficulties of also not being able to read body language, not being able to interpret visual clues. So it's an even bigger uphill struggle for us than it is for deaf people. Impact on how one is perceived by others. People do judge you, and they like to say they don't, but like I just said, you say to somebody, "Can you please repeat that?" People do get annoyed with you. People start to think you're not paying attention. They think that you're just too lazy to listen. You know, so people do look at you negatively because of you've got coping skills. One of the problems with coping mechanisms is that nobody has ever taught us how to cope. Every single autistic person you talk to will tell you they have to teach themselves how to cope. They have to work it out for themselves. And some people are successful. Some people are just completely fail at that. They just never managed to get that skill of coping. And they are the people that usually end up with their lives being ruined by it because they've not learned those coping mechanisms. We need to start developing coping mechanisms, guidance, information on how, not just for us to cope, but how other people can make it easier for us to cope. We need to be getting teachers trained in how to communicate with autistic people in a way that helps that autistic child, because if we don't teach them coping mechanisms at that age, they're going to struggle in adult life. If we can give them those tools to cope when they're children, you've given them a good start in life that they might possibly be able to avoid all the depression and difficulties that we have to face as adults. Yeah, the rest of it is just about coping mechanisms and technological aids that we can use. But I think the take-home message is that we need to teach people how to cope with this advanced. We need to train people how to teach children to cope with difficult listening environments. I don't know who's next.
Thank you very much, Graham. Yeah, I had to get you to rush through the last couple of slides there, so we keep to time. But yeah, as Graham says, there's some hopeful inklings as to what the strategies might be that would help people cope better in these situations. And now I'm going to hand over to George Bendo, who's going to talk about the internet survey. Let me see if I can. There we are.
Okay, so there were 79 participants with usable responses. We had to remove a couple who either didn't have a diagnosis of autism or were seeking one, or people who had diagnosed hearing loss. There were 19 multiple choice questions and 3 open-ended questions. 2 of the open-ended questions ended up receiving very similar responses based on the way they were worded, so it made sense to kind of group those responses together. Next page. So it's for the multiple choice ones, we asked some relatively simple questions. First one was, for each listening situation described below, how easy would it be to would you to find it to hear and understand what's being said? And we had a variety of situations. First, we had listening to a person talking in a quiet environment on the left. Most people said it was relatively easy. And then we have in the second, third, and fourth columns situations with mechanical noise, music, and then other people having conversations at the same time, with moderate levels of those noise, background noise levels in the top row, and loud versions of those noise levels in the bottom row. And one of the interesting results from this is that for the respondents, that just two people having another conversation produced the same type of, or caused the same level of difficulty in terms of understanding conversations as loud, very loud mechanical background noise or very loud music would have. So it's rather impressive that just two other people could cause as much issues with understanding and comprehending audio as something severely loud. Next slide. And then people were asked about their impressions, whether the following listening situations caused them greater difficulty than most other people their age. And this was kind of contingent on whether people said it was harder or easier. But it's there was generally the impression among the respondents that they were having much more difficulty than their peers in terms of understanding conversations under a broad variety of situations. Next slide. And then people were asked about whether their listening difficulties had impacts in various aspects of their lives. And there are quite a few different things where it has had an impact. Yeah, as you can see from this, like everybody said that, yeah, it's like, or a majority of respondents said that there was an impact in terms of, well, skipping the first one, which is doing anything in terms of people's education and career, in terms of their social life, in terms of their feelings about themselves, and in terms of interacting with other people. Next slide. So, yeah, this just summarizes what I already said, that people had particular difficulty with understanding conversations when just one other conversation was taking place. And this was equivalent to being in a location with loud music or loud machinery. Next slide. So we asked these two questions: are there any listening situations you find particularly easy or difficult? And is there anything that makes listening harder or easier? And the responses that we got didn't quite divide up into the same themes in quite an even way that were used in the interview, but they do more or less match up with the themes from the interview data. There are some interesting differences. So multisensory interactions is definitely one case where there's a significant amount of overlap. So this quote, for example, it's especially hard when I'm generally a bit overwhelmed, like in stores with bright lights, checkout sounds, people, music, etc. Or people making comments, quite a few comments on high fidelity hearing protection, where people say there are days they'll bring concert earplugs to work meetings. A surprising number of comments about earplugs. Next slide. There's more responses in the questionnaires, and this may be because of the nature of how the interviews were conducted, that there was difficulty with telecommunications, including what we're doing now, but also with phone conversations as well. And there were issues with broadcast audio, quite a few people making references to movies and television. This top quote, for example: if you're speaking to me on the phone and there is any kind of noise going on in the room that I am in, I will really struggle to hear you. That was a very common response within the questionnaires. The second line, also television shows or radio, often a lot of background noise, many different accents, mouths are not clearly visible. It was just very interesting how many people responded about difficulty with television. So as I indicated before, the interviews were predominantly conducted via Zoom, and there may have been some sort of self-selection bias in the interviews towards people who were actually comfortable with conducting the interviews via Zoom. And so people who have struggled with telecoms and broadcast audio may have been much more reluctant to volunteer for Zoom interviews. And hence the importance of the questionnaire as a complement to the interviews. Next slide. Is there anything that you think our research should look into? And there were quite a few interesting different suggestions on things like alternate audio tests, non-audio stimuli, concentration in audio processing and interventions. As alternate audio tests, just as an example, a couple of people made the comments that the typical audiology lab room is too unrealistic an environment, and people, a couple of people reported how they would often score well as having perfect hearing in these audiology rooms, but going out into the real world, and it's not necessarily being around people. So a couple people commented on how just being in a larger room, like an auditorium, and getting the echoes in that auditorium type environment caused more difficulty with audio comprehension. So that is an example of the type of thing. The non-audio stimuli, Graham also talks about this as well, but it's just reading about how others, and it's a subsegment of the respondents, to be clear, so not all autistic people may have this type of response, but there were a few people who responded to issues with understanding audio when they were receiving visual or other types of stimuli. Yeah, and I don't think I'm going to say much more in terms of the bullet points there. So next slide.
I think we're on to Alex then. So thank you very much, George. Well said. Alex, if you want to kick off now.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up?
We can.
Yeah, good. Right, so I'm going to take you through to the end, do the wrap up, talk generally about the overarching implications from the studies that we've done so far, and the potential research that might result from this as well. Sorry, I thought this slide was actually part of George's because it was implications for the end of the last study. Let me see if I can just navigate around it then. So I think we've determined that there is a significant level of impact of listening difficulties on the individual from the two studies that we've done here, and what we've found is that when we've presented it to mixed audiences with autistic individuals, we've had a really great response in terms of positive feedback, and lots of people saying that this is a core problem for them, and essential to their kind of difficulties functioning on a daily basis. There appears to be this really important implication for social participation, which a number of people told us was above and beyond the other social communication difficulties that they might experience being autistic, and this was another layer of a barrier for them. We've also, interestingly, I think Graham would have talked about this, but we've got this kind of reciprocal, bidirectional difficulty between the speech perception difficulties and emotions. So we're having one impact on the other, and vice versa. So they're kind of becoming exponentially worse. And of course, all of this is impacting on the individual's self-perception, their self-efficacy, their feelings of self-worth, and it also impacts on their levels of fatigue. So contributing again to existing social fatigue that they might experience. So really quite impactful stuff. I'll just read this last bit. The significance of these findings rests in part on social interaction difficulties being a core feature of autism and on the high prevalence of secondary mental health difficulties for this group. Next slide, please. Okay, so we found for us, this is pointing to a number of things that we need to do in this area of research. So as Hannah said at the beginning, you know, a lot of studies up until this point have not been adequately powered. That needs to be addressed in any future research. Our experience of working with autistic team members who you've met today, but the research questions coming from the grassroots up has been the most positive element of this study, really, and it's made the research much more useful and impactful and relevant than we could have ever hoped on our own. So that's really important, and we would suggest that any future research in this area works in a similar way. One thing, of course, that our autistic collaborators will be able to help us with is making the data collection procedures relevant for that group. If we'd been in the laboratories over the last year, that's what we would have already been working on, how to adapt our environment so that we're actually testing what we think we're testing and not testing, in fact, you know, other environmental distractors, for example. We recommend that research should try and disentangle all of these factors, as you've heard from the two studies, lots and lots and lots of data, all pointing to potentially different areas that are impacting on speech perception. So we need to understand that better, and that's really going to involve a quite coordinated approach to picking out and testing the different elements, which would be probably best done in a laboratory setting. We would also recommend very large sample populations in some cases for testing heterogeneity. Now, we know that the autistic experience is very individualised, and so really we want to know how these kind of speech perception difficulties cluster for the individual, and does that tell us anything about their experience or their levels of problems in that area or that area of function. And something that's come through from the community very strongly is that really research should be geared towards ultimately providing answers for the population, so clinical applications and providing self-help strategies. Next slide, please. So myself and Hannah are now enormous advocates of working collaboratively with our autistic research partners in this project, and I really can't imagine how we'd go back to doing it in any other way. So totally would totally like to encourage everybody to do this if at all possible. It has given us an insight into a research question that was lacking, but our autistic partners have been involved at every level, developing the methodology, designing the project, undertaking the analysis, and interpreting data, and finally disseminating it to the wider population. So speaking as the neurotypical element of the team, it has been absolutely essential. It's provided us with insight onto the impact for autistic individuals, and it has helped, and the data from our study, as well as working collaboratively, has given us a great insight into how we might be able to shape procedures for the future to make them work best for the individuals that we're hoping to assess. The other big benefit is something called neurotypical overshadowing, and this is very common where the neurotypical researchers are using their interpretation of the data and really maybe taking the interpretation off into an area where maybe it's not as appropriate to go, and we need to maybe think about how we reflect on the data and demonstrate the actual autistic experience rather than our interpretation of the autistic experience. So that's another area where, as I said, especially in qualitative research, but also in the interpretation of quantitative data, it's so important. And the other reason I guess we'd recommend collaborative research is that by working with autistic researchers, I mean, George and Graham are already researchers anyway in their own areas, but by including autistic individuals into our research more generally, hopefully we're going to create some legacy and actually have people from the community able to guide projects from the grassroots up more regularly. Thank you. Okay, so what would we like to do in the future? We've got a few ideas. We're currently seeking funding for 2 parallel studies, with part of which being laboratory based, and this would allow us to do some of that fine-grained disentangling of all those different factors we looked at before, the contributing acoustic and non-acoustic factors, the listening anomalies, and any other compounding factors. We'd be able to more carefully pull that apart in laboratory testing conditions. And we can broaden out our sample size and get a bigger population by doing some work online and using speech perception testing methods in an online format as well. So hopefully that would cover both the detail and getting the sample size that we need. Okay. Coming as I do from a background in language and communication, this is of great interest to me. Of course, speech perception is an absolutely integral part in language and communication. And so it would be really interesting to kind of disentangle this element further as well. So it is a complicated and challenging area, but potentially looking at speech perception and language and communication in terms of both development and in terms of functionality would be a really interesting move forward with this research topic. Yeah, thank you. Coping strategies. So we didn't start this project by asking about coping strategies, but when we started talking to people, this was a major theme that came through repeatedly in the data. And what we've realised is that there is a huge amount of, as Graham said, self-taught knowledge about this subject, coping strategies that people have developed after years of not really having any support. It's labour intensive and it's usually cost the individual quite a lot in terms of putting effort in and developing those strategies. And what we've started to do is collate that data, and we intend to continue with that process. And therefore, by using what the autistic population have already generated, we can feed that back into things like clinical materials and self-help strategies. Next one, thank you. Other clinical implications. So we need to upskill audiologists. That's become really clear. I don't know how many of you know, but in autism diagnosis, one thing we do ask parents at a very early age is whether there's been a hearing difficulty, whether someone's had difficulty turning to attend to a voice. So do all audiologists realise that this is something that people might come to them with, which is then could be an early indication of something like autism? Do they know that? How well are they prepared to talk about that? And a lot of the individuals in our study also talked about the fact that they went to audiologists long before they went for a diagnosis because they had problems with speech perception and auditory processing. So what happens when they go to those individuals? Currently, not much, unfortunately. So we can upskill audiologists to be able to provide basic strategies, basic ideas, and maybe point that person into thinking, okay, this may be a profile similar to autism, maybe you should get it checked out. Next one. We're very happy to say that this pair of studies has already been of interest to other people, and Macquarie University have shown some interest in what we're doing. Sharon Cameron and Harvey Dillon are working on computer-based auditory training material, which was something, again, that the autistic population said very much that they wanted some training materials. And these training materials are intended to improve speech perception in background noise. So hopefully our data will go to help that. And then, sorry, last one, yeah, potential impact. So coming full circle back to the Autism at Manchester group who started the whole project off, really. Lena, one of the team members there and autism advocate, when we presented this data to her, she said, I know hundreds of autistic people and difficulty with auditory processing and background noise is the only universal characteristic I've been able to find. And I hope that goes some way to demonstrating the relevance we feel of this project. And our acknowledgements to all of those groups. Thank you.